right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today to discuss an important and very timely topic, student data privacy. My name is Sara Pietrowski, and I serve as CASBO's Chief Governmental Relations Officer. I'm joined here today by 4 of the state's leading experts on this topic. Namita Brown and Gretchen Shipley, both partners at F3 Law, Maggie Bunten, President-elect of California IT and Education, and Erick Steelman, Treasurer of California IT and Education. I know you will find this presentation helpful as you field questions related to the information you collect and maintain related to student immigration status and disclosure of that sensitive information. Please know that CASBO is monitoring federal policy changes closely and will continue to keep you informed on key developments. Before we jump in, a few housekeeping items. As a reminder to all attendees, this webinar is being recorded. All registered attendees will receive a link to the recording later today. If you have any questions, please direct them to the Q&A. This will help us follow up with any questions we are unable to answer during the webinar. I will now turn it over to Namita to get us started.
Hi, good afternoon. Glad that you're all here with us today. I wanted to sort of paint a picture at the 60,000-foot level around what is happening in our schools with respect to immigration. Most of you know there is a lot of angst happening amongst districts, amongst boards, amongst superintendents, and at school sites, and not to mention parent communities and students around what the latest round of immigration-related executive orders mean for them. And just for your information, President Trump signed a executive order that basically stated that the long-standing practice that the federal government had of not having federal law enforcement actions happening near sensitive sites, which included public schools across this nation, was actually set aside by President Trump's executive order. And so there has been a lot of angst around, what does this mean for my site? Are ICE agents going to come and conduct raids at our site? Are they going to come onto school grounds, and are they going to stomp through school sites to go interview students to get data that districts have and own and maintain? Are they going to have carte blanche with respect to the data that is maintained by districts? Are they going to have access to what a student's immigration status is? Are they going to have access to the enrollment data that students provide to districts, that lead districts to actually enroll them into their school districts? Are they going to have access to all of these kinds of information? Today, I want to say to you, from a big picture perspective, what it basically means is that, yes, and federal law enforcement action, which generally is implemented through ICE, can happen around schools. The likelihood that federal ICE agents are going to come onto your school grounds, that possibility has always existed in the law. There is no new law that is putting an additional step that now ICE can come on school grounds. That enforcement action right has always existed in the law. What we are going to talk about today is basically when you have law enforcement, including ICE, because ICE is federal law enforcement. And what we are going to talk about is what kind of data access do they have? There are going to be policies that most of your districts and county offices of education already have in place. You've got policies that talk about how student data is maintained. You've got policies that talk about when law enforcement comes onto campus, whether it's your local sheriff, whether it's your local PD or federal ICE agents, how do we interact with them? But this particular webinar is going to talk more about what happens when they give you a order. What happens when they give you a warrant? What kind of data that the district maintains do we have to provide to them? Generally speaking, if there is a request via a valid court order or a warrant, or if there are exigent circumstances, 9 times out of 10, depending on the language of the document that is being presented to the school district, we have to comply with it. But then there are other things like subpoenas, or there are requests for information or court orders that are not as timely, that require document production, that you as a district representative is going to respond to in your capacity as a public employee. And that is going to be driven primarily by the kind of data on student status that we maintain. We are going to talk about public records that are perhaps directory information with respect to students. We're going to talk about FERPA records, student records that are maintained in the CUME file. And then we're going to maintain and talk about things like emails that are just maintained in the normal scope of business. So really, when we are talking about immigration, it's not just federal ICE enforcement with respect to talking to a student or arresting a member of the community on school grounds. We are also talking about student data. And that is the general overview of this information session that we are going to talk and take questions from you about. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to perhaps Gretchen to
Sure.
sing.
I wasn't sure if the folks from CITE want to talk a little bit about data management and data mapping and the type of information that is typically collected by a school district, or I could go into the data privacy overview. What's your preference, Erick and Maggie?
Yeah, we're happy to chime in on at least from a student information system standpoint. What are
That would
the
be great.
predominant what are the predominant data fields that are being stored within the SIS? Who has access to it? And then go into role-based security as far as what we can do to potentially lock that down. If ever there was a time, this is kind of a perfect opportunity. I'm going to use the COVID. Let's reimagine how we can possibly do things in terms to process and procedure. And most definitely, I think a lot of this is going to come down to how we conduct professional development training, and are we being a little bit more proactive to it. Maggie, anything else before we kind of jump in on it?
I think you hit the nail on the head pretty well there. It's a good opportunity to review those best practices with your student support services department, your ed services team, your classified staff at the school site level who's actually working and engaging with the community to collect a lot of these records and participate in the enrollment process.
Yeah, and once again, I think this is a really good time to be having this discussion. I mean, it's sad that we need to be having this talk to begin with, but most LEAs are preparing for online registration or the annual validation of information for the upcoming school year. And a lot of this has been integrated into online registration systems through your student information system provider, whether that be, PowerSchool, Aries, Synergy, all the biggies that are used within the state. So, and I think the most pertinent question is, are you collecting data that could potentially help identify students that are not citizens? And there are a lot of data fields that are built into the student information system that you may or may not be aware of. Maybe they're fields that you aren't using, but there's certainly fields that are kind of nested throughout the application. And good examples of that, I even in my own system, there were some fields that were buried down into further screens that basically identified, are you a citizen or not? What is your citizenship? What is your citizenship status? What is the country in which you have your citizenship? Those fields have no bearing as far as what we have to submit to the state in regards to a CalPAS requirement. They're just canned fields. And also within the student information system, you have the ability to create custom fields, which you may have utilized in the past to collect some of that information. But once again, those are not fields that should be collected in this day and age.
And if I may just lean in here and say, people are not collecting data just for the sake of collecting data, right? Very often you've got front office managers in many of these school sites who are actually interfacing with parents and asking for enrollment documentation. They use language such as, I need to see the birth certificate. Well, you don't need to see the birth certificate, because what you really want to do is basically make sure that the student's age is whatever the age appropriate cutoff for that TK or the kindergarten enrollment is. So the Attorney General's website, California Attorney General's website, has a very good list of optional documents that you can request to see and verify what the student's age is. A baptismal certificate may do just fine. You do not need to see a birth certificate. And then bottom line here again, this is where professional development that Erick just talked about comes into play. You can look at a birth certificate, you can verify the student's age, and then you return the birth certificate back to the parent. You do not need to store it, you do not need to make copies, because anything that you make copies of or store on your system becomes a document maintained by the district. You may not want it to be maintained, but guess what? If it is being maintained in a file at a school site, it is part of the district's records. And so we just need to break that mindset where we're using language that sort of makes it seem that we are looking for documents that relate to a student's place of birth when we don't need that. We're just verifying age and residency for purposes of enrollment.
And Namita, I think that raises an important question. So you just mentioned, for purposes of age verification, a parent may offer a birth certificate, and just to reiterate what you were just saying, they don't need to copy and maintain it. They just need to look at it. But what do we do about all the districts who may have had a past practice? What do we do about those who actually are holding on to birth certificates? I think we'd all agree it's probably not a good idea to go out and shred those documents. My personal opinion, and I'd be open to other advice from the panel, is offer to return those documents. All they needed to do was look at them. They don't need to hang on to them any further, but rather than destroy them, perhaps they offer to return them to the families now that age has been verified. Thoughts?
I agree. I think that is probably the cleanest way. And I just want you to note, for people who are here on the call, who are generally members of CASBO and working in business office, you all know that student records that are maintained are are records that have to be maintained in perpetuity, just like employee records. So it's not the kind that you can say, oh, we've met the 5-year mark and therefore we are going to, get rid of these documents or get rid of these records. I think Gretchen's point that you return them back to the parents because we've verified them seems like a workable plan. But I wouldn't just look at student birth records to return back to the parents. If there are other documents that you are keeping that is in above and beyond you need to keep, then you want to have a policy that says records that we don't need to maintain, that are just maintained by us, will be returned back to the parents. So it doesn't appear that you're only doing this for birth certificates, trying to circumvent any kind of a federal requirement or any kind of a federal immigration related process.
And Namita and Gretchen, if I can expand on that a little bit. So part of the enrollment process for some districts may include the online enrollment process. And I see some questions in the Q&A currently. So if districts are capturing or asking parents or caregivers to upload documents via an online portal, so parents may be capturing photographs of those documents and uploading them for the online enrollment process, is there some guidance that you can provide to those districts on, is it language that they may put in the online enrollment portal to parents to say, please do not submit these types of documents? What is your suggestion there?
I think there are a couple of ways we can do this. Depending on the district, depending on the, the culture of the district, you could have language that says either we spot check that you may be required to bring your documents for examination at a later date. Or you could have something that says you can upload these documents. However, once submitted to the district, they become district records, and we would have to turn them over if asked by state or federal government. Or you could have an option where a parent verifies to the age via the online enrollment process, but leaves open the district's ability to ask that parent to come down to a district site to be able to have their documents examined by a district employee. I mean, I think that would be the way to go. Again, depending on the district that you work with, depending on the kind of demographics you serve, and depending on what kind of enrollment numbers you're talking about, if this is large school, small school, if you have newcomer population, there are going to be various permutations and combinations of those particular options.
Yeah, and
Oh, go ahead, Eric. Sorry.
I was just going to say that most of the LEAs that I've talked to have done exactly that. So, I mean, Ed Code 48002 is really the kind of the governing body in this particular area, and it's basically saying that birth certificate is a valid form of identification for verification, right? So most of the student information systems are going to create a process that allows them to upload that. But of course, all of those areas are customizable. So based on the document type, you can potentially change it so that it's not an upload. It's just, hey, you will verify that information in person at your first registration date. So we're seeing a lot of LEAs that are doing that. So anything else typically is one that they will allow them to upload. But as far as getting rid of it, if it is in digital format, and because they have to provide the document type, it makes it really easy from a digital side to get rid of it. It's those physical CUME folders that we're worried about the most.
Yeah, and it's not just the enrollment data that I worry about. It's also the other places where student immigration status is vulnerable. Remember, the law of the land is that we have to provide education to every kid that comes through our door, irrespective of their immigration status. And so I think we have gotten into this habit of lazily, not intentionally, but using lazy language to ask for birth certificates. The same thing happens when you are trying to enroll kids in free and reduced lunch programs. You're asking for income tax verification. Again, that stuff you just are verifying. You don't need to put that data. I make the joke that we are all now in decision-making positions, and we are product of the happy Xerox generation. We came of age where everything could be copied and we no longer had triplicate forms. And so we have to get out of this idea that everything needs a copy to be maintained. You verify what the income tax bracket is, whether or not the parents qualify to have their child enrolled in free and reduced lunch, and you move on. The same thing happens with other wraparound services that kids may be getting if they are part of the migrant ed programs, if they're a part of any kind of wraparound service for newcomer kids that are coming and being provided by district. You just want to be sure that you verify their status to be eligible for services. You don't need to create a court record or any kind of a documentary record to show to your supervisor or to maintain for the district that they were eligible. You can always verify and return the documents.
Eric, I wanted to, or Maggie, I wanted to pose a question to you all as well about student information systems. I understand some platforms, or maybe it's a customizable feature where we've seen districts that had a check the box that a student is undocumented. And if that's something that you're aware of that districts are doing, and I want to talk with this group about what, you know, a recommended practice is if they have that feature. I could easily see a request, whether it's from a Public Records Act or perhaps from, you know, some sort of law enforcement. Can you just run the search for every student that checked the box is undocumented, and whether that is really needed or required is a student information system feature?
Yeah, and I'll just say on my personal behalf, you know, I was kind of surprised when we started having this discussion, and I was actually appreciative of this discussion because it forced me to go look through the thousands and thousands of fields that we have within our student demographic area. And when I stumbled upon the fact that there is a checkbox, a yes, no for U.S. citizenship, it isn't one that's being used, and it's not one that certainly is on any enrollment form within our district. But there is an area for them to document it. And what often happens is if there's an opportunity to interact with a parent, and maybe a parent's providing information or having a discussion, that enrollment person, whoever is responsible, say in the guidance office, may actually accidentally check that box. You know, and it's not for us to say whether they should or shouldn't, but if it isn't a field that we're requiring and it's not a state mandate, then that field should be turned off. It should be hidden, right?
I just want to sort of have a caveat here. these are big policy decisions. These are not operational decisions. So I want to urge all of the attendees that this is not a decision you come to on your own where you go and turn off a field or a switch in your SIS. I think these are driven by board policy. These are driven by the governing board, the superintendent, the executive cabinet. These are policy decisions. And I don't want anybody to walk away from here thinking that just because it is not required in the law that they have the carte blanche to say extra field, extra work, and therefore we're going to switch it off. These are big policy decisions, and they are driven by the governing board. And you know what? We are not a monolith. There are many districts in the state that actually the board wants to track that data, right or wrong. That's their prerogative. That's why they're elected to the office that they currently sit in. I just want to be clear. This is not an operational efficiency issue.
And I completely agree. And I thank you for verifying that, because this definitely shouldn't be this is what you should or shouldn't do, but you definitely just want to bring awareness to the fact that there are these fields here, and it should invoke a conversation internally about whether or not it's needed going forward.
And I would just say one more thing, and defer to all of you, but we are talking clearly just about the student information system at this point, but really the student data around a student's immigration status exists in many ways. I had a counselor who asked me, my kids are talking to me as they're preparing to go to college and trying to fill out FAFSA. How do we advise them regarding the status of, they're a mixed status family? How do I help them understand what they should say or what they shouldn't say on FAFSA? Again, this is not a conversation that we can have because we are public employees working in a school district. You are not immigration experts. You're not immigration status and, FAFSA experts. There's a whole body of law. There's a whole industry of people that are experts in that. And I think we are operating beyond the scope of our expertise if we start giving people advice on FAFSA. The other place where this is coming up is kids are beginning to write their college profile essays, right? And so I've got a kid in college, their essay, as they sort of start thinking, they talk about the prompts, they talk about what makes them unique. And for many kids who are undocumented or come from mixed status families, they write about that. And they write about it and they send it to their counselor or they send it to their English teacher to look at the essay. But guess what? Now we have a document, a public record that is being maintained on our systems that talk about the student's status. So while we're talking about the SIS enrollment issues, those things can be operationalized. It's the one-off, as Erick said, the hard files that are maintained at a school site, these emails, these documents that exist between employees of the district, perhaps parents, perhaps students, that are available in email format that really also give much concern to people who are in charge of data, because you are maintaining student data relevant to their immigration status on district server that lives beyond the SIS.
And Namita, if I can jump in there as well, there are some comments in the chat area. Yes, there are fields and data that you do need to collect for CalPADS, for the state reporting system that is collected typically through your student information system. That information does include birth city, birth state, country of residence, things of that nature. So the direction, and again, Namita, this is where I'm going to rely on you and your expertise. The direction isn't to not collect that information that you need. It's just don't capture a birth certificate. If you don't need to, don't store those records in a student CUME folder. Don't digitize those records, because now from a technology standpoint, you're required, right, for that record retention policy. So those types of guidances, you do need that information for your state reporting It's just be cognizant, put those best practices in, have those conversations with your student support services, your ed services team around what are the documents. Are all of our websites in line in terms of the documentation we're requesting for age verification for TK and K? Make sure that your policies are aligned with your practices.
Yeah, agreed. 100%. And I see a lot of questions in the chat about keeping birth certificates because you are, that's how you sort of figure out the date and that's how you figure out the parents' names. But you don't need to maintain it. I mean, and I'm just spitballing here. I know you guys at the site level figure out how enrollment works, but maybe it is having parents come in and having something set up where they are actually tapping it in real time and somebody actually looks at the birth certificate to verify it. I know these are only adding additional duties to your already full plate, but there are going to be different ways. Now, I'm not suggesting by any stretch of the imagination that if your district decides to have a policy that birth certificates are the way that they're going to operate, that's their prerogative. But I want you to know that if a parent comes in and says, heck no, I'm not giving you my kid's birth certificate, this is what I'm going to give you. And these are the various ways we can identify and verify my child's, date of birth. Guess what? You've got to comply with it. So that's the conversation that we are having. It's not to say birth certificates all is bad. It's about saying that the age can be verified in a different way.
And I might as well jump in because I have it right in front of me, the AG's guidance on what can be collected other than a birth certificate to verify age. As you mentioned, it's baptism certificate. It can be a passport. It can be a statement from the local registrar. And if none of those are available, a parent can just sign an affidavit. And that is from our state attorney general. So just to, reiterate what you're saying, Namita, and Maggie, you brought up the CalPads example, and this might be a good opportunity to quickly provide a general overview of data sharing as it applies to FERPA. And FERPA is just for educational records, not necessarily the unofficial documents like emails, which also could have implications. But just as far as our educational records, I just want to remind you all, the baseline rule with FERPA is you don't share a student's educational record without parental consent, unless it falls under one of the exceptions. Well, the first exception we normally look at is things like directory information. Immigration status is not in their directory information. So it's not, the directory information is typically things like age and address and name. Secondly, school official exception. That is where you have other agencies with a legitimate educational interest in your students, such as the state of California processing CalPads. You can share student educational records with these other state agencies, maybe it's your county office of education. They're performing an administrative function for the school district in processing this data. They also, that is within FERPA, you can share it through CalPads. Many of you have interagency data sharing agreements between your county office, maybe with your homeless youth state agency, the juvenile justice system. A lot of public agencies have interagency data sharing agreements. And it might be a good opportunity to revisit those data sharing agreements and the breadth and the scope of what type of data is shared there. And then a couple of other exceptions to FERPA that apply is, a health and safety emergency. I can't imagine a scenario where sharing immigration status would be a health and safety emergency, but that's another FERPA exception. And then, as Namita mentioned earlier, there's going to be instances where they're going to claim exigent circumstances, or they have a lawful subpoena or a warrant. And I think what we've talked about across the board here is making sure that there is training and your staff have resources. There's resources out there on when they need to comply. And maybe it's not the front office staff. Maybe they ask their school site administrator. Or and so I just want to share with you all that there's a difference between data sharing educational records with organizations like CalPads versus, law enforcement is at your school site with a subpoena, and knowing the difference and making sure that we have training across the board for staff, for school site administrators, for front office staff to understand those different scenarios. One other thing I wanted to mention, maybe while I'm on this scope, is law enforcement sharing of data. Many, if someone wants to chime in on this, many school districts have partnerships with local law enforcement or allow law enforcement to look at their student information system. I know I personally typically recommend that you have an MOU. Outside the immigration issue, sometimes law enforcement asks to have access to a student information system. I don't know if they're tracking truancy, whatever the case might be, but I personally always put language in there that the law enforcement's only going to access it for lawful purposes and that they're going to comply with FERPA and any other applicable state or federal law. But that's another, just like I mentioned, your interagency data sharing agreements, you might want to take a minute to look at your MOU with law enforcement or what type of data sharing arrangement you have with law enforcement if they do in fact have access to your student information system, which could be housing scanned in birth certificate, which could be housing that undocumented checkbox. So it's just another sort of data sharing and data retention area you might want to take a look at.
Yeah,
And
sorry, it's
go
a good
ahead,
point,
Erick.
Gretchen. I know, Namita, you had mentioned it also when you were talking about free and reduced lunch. Once that information is entered, it is considered sensitive information, and so most student information systems are going to have role-based security where they're going to be potentially taking steps to ensure that only specific roles have access to that information. And I think it's pertinent for the discussion of not only if you're evaluating what types of data that you're collecting and what fields that you're still utilizing within the organization, but also who has access to that information. Is that something that maybe your SROs you want to reconsider whether or not they should have access to specific fields? I know most MOUs are basic student demographic information. They don't go really detailed as far as what level, but maybe that's something that needs to be added and considered.
Yeah, really good point. I'm in the northern part of the state, and the trend here in the northern part is that more and more districts are decoupling with local police departments, and there's a real movement not to have SROs on campus. So the data sharing agreements with law enforcement agencies are few and far between, but I think they are really good points to keep in mind. I also want to, and I am cognizant that the audience today are business officials, and so they don't have the same interface with perhaps school sites as perhaps human resources folks do. But I do think there is a level of training that needs to happen around documents and maintenance of documents. This is like a real need in districts statewide. People just keep documents, and sites sometimes don't understand. They think that they are keeping the document. It's not at the DO, and therefore, it's not a real official record, but it is a record. And so there has to be a conversation that takes place where there is some training around how a document lives as a business record for the district. It doesn't have to be at the DO. There has to be a conversation around maintenance and adoption of some kind of document retention policy. And this is like this is the bane of many CBOs. You guys want to have a document retention policy, and IT folks always, the CTOs always want that as well, because you want to have as much robust data as possible, but it's human resources and the student side of the house that maintain documents in perpetuity who don't want to have that responsibility. So there's got to be more of a converging effort around effective document management that needs to be done, and perhaps a greater eye around studying this issue and studying it not just from the immigration sense, but from the lens of data privacy and document retention and public records, as districts and county offices of education look at adopting a documentary retention policy.
Namita, you mentioned in there public records, and we've talked about it a few times, and just to, remind the group, I think it could be a part of this training that you're talking about, is reminding your staff that any email communications may be subject to a Public Records Act request. And so whether it's immigration or any other sensitive topic, that is what we've been talking about a lot of official district records. It's those emails that are unofficial district records, but are public records nonetheless. And while as lawyers, we can try to make arguments that that type of information should be exempt from a request, it'd be a lot better if you didn't have it in the first place. And so it's part of educating and training your staff when you're communicating about sensitive student information, that it's probably best kept out of an email.
Yeah, I always go back to one of the earliest Public Records Act matters I ever worked on. That was when Chipotle first came onto the scene. So that's how old I am. There was a school site near newly minted Chipotle, and the local paper did a Public Records Act request asking the district to search emails at a particular school site using the term Chipotle as a search query. And I'm embarrassed to say there were tons of emails between teachers that we produced that were maintained on the district server. We could not say, hey, not a record, because anything we have on our server is public record, that we turned over to the local newspaper. And the local newspaper ran a story about how district workforce was spending so much time talking about Chipotle and not really focused on student achievement. So it is one of those things that is very important. Anything that you put on an email is a public record unless the exceptions apply. And I see a question here about the student CUME file. Those are really important issues, like what lives in a student CUME file. Very often you see emails between teachers, emails from an IEP team meeting going into the student CUME file. And Gretchen, would you talk generally around what a student CUME file should have? It's generally not emails and communications, but what would you say, actual educational records?
Yes, and Erick and Maggie, you all are welcome to jump in on this well, but typically it would be grades, academic information, their transcript, disciplinary records could be in there. But what you think of as things that get maybe sent home to the parents. I don't know if health records live there or in, the wellness center separately. Students IEP, I don't know if that goes in the CUME records, but and really quick, getting back to that question, two different of you asked for a training. And I know as a group, we talked about, this is a good opportunity to collect questions, and maybe we do a 2.0 or a handout, either a second follow-up webinar with a deeper, where we drill down in more detail about one of you asked for more extensive record training, and the other one asked for, more specifically what must go into a CUME file. And I think that would be a good follow-up piece for CASBO and CITE and F3. Sorry, Erick, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, between CSBA, AXA, all of them, I think we need a great resource in and around data retention. So, and I'll just say that organically, there is less and less that is being stored physically in the digital CUME folder or in the CUME folder itself, because there's so much interoperability with the data itself. So, I mean, IEPs typically are living inside, the system of record for special education, right? So there's less and less that has to come. For a high school district like myself, we still get a little bit because it's basically a transfer from district to district. But it is nice that it's organically changing and getting smaller as the years go on.
And I just looked at one of the other the webinar chat where it talked about people are collecting data because you've got mom and dad, perhaps a family that is divorced and they don't get along, and they are asking for the student birth certificate because it has all the data. And the last line of the comment is so telling, because what it says is we do not look for immigration information at all. And I completely appreciate that and understand that. But I think it is not about the district looking for that data. It's just that immigration data, by virtue of that birth certificate, now lives with the district. And so if there is ever a conversation or a request to provide the data, we now have an avenue to respond with. We may not have to generate a field, a special table, but we turn over all the birth certificates that we have. So that is the point. And, you know, that is the point of making sure that we are training our folks to use alternate language to ask for the documents that they need to enroll students that doesn't solely rely upon birth records. And you know, if you are providing a birth record from a different part of the world, does it automatically trigger something? That is people's fear. And the other thing that I'm seeing more and more in the field right now is this guarantee by districts saying, we will not share your status information with federal law enforcement. I mean, and again, there are many boards that have taken that position, and I say they are entitled to that. They are allowed to take that position, but at the end of the day, we are bound by what the law says, and if it is a document that we maintain that doesn't fall into the carve-outs that allows us to hold back public documents, such as a student cum file, just as personnel file, we have to provide that to whoever is requesting the kind of information. So I want to be very clear that we don't guarantee people absolutes, because absolutes are only limited by the statute and the laws that we have to comply with.
Yeah, and typically, to answer the question earlier about what's typically in a cum folder, Gretchen, it's, you know, important academic or health information for the student is typically what should be contained within the cum folder.
Thank you. And just to clarify it, we put it in the chat, but I misspoke. It's not the IEP, that's kept separately. So thank you for clarifying that. I also saw a question in the Q&A about uploading electricity bills for address verification. And I just want to make sure, I just want to clarify, when a student is enrolling, there are two separate record requests. One is their enrollment information, and the second is their age verification. So for enrollment purposes, you should not be maintaining their birth certificate. There's other documents for enrollment purposes that you can collect, property tax, rental property, utility bills, pay stubs, voter registration, and some other kind of catch-all exemptions. It is the age verification where they may offer to show you a birth certificate, or as we talked about, they may be uploading it online, but there's questions about maintaining that. But that's where it's the age verification, where there's the alternatives are things like a baptismal certificate or local registrar or passport as an alternative. So I just want to clarify, somebody asked about utility bills. Yes, I mean, we do need to do residency verification unless they are a homeless student. They have a separate process, but it is acceptable to ask for utility bills because, as you all know, that students need to typically live within the district boundaries.
Yeah, and another place, another unexpected place where I have discovered birth certificates live is for high school kids who play sports. When athletic directors make them sign on to see whether they're eligible, you have physical forms, they took this physical, you've got certain kinds of other waivers that parents sign, but they also upload the birth certificate to establish age. Again, CIF, my firm represents CIF, and they are working on this piece of it. But if there is a way that we can help verify it rather than uploading it to your system, because everything is electronic, right? Parents sign all of these forms electronically. This is another place where we have inadvertently created a practice of storing birth records that may show the status of a child's family or a child's own immigration status. So just FYI, that's another place that we should be contemplating and working with our athletic directors around how to get that data point verified and not upload birth certificates to the system.
I've been going through some of the Q&A and trying to address some of those questions. One of them asked about documents that are not kept on the district server, but kept on local devices. And, you know, we do whole separate trainings on Public Records Act requests. but records that would otherwise be a district record that are kept, if it is district business, being kept on your local device or your personal account may still be subject to a Public Records Act request. Just because it's kept outside of the district server, it's kept on your personal laptop or something, you may receive a request to turn over all district records, regardless if it's on a personal device or not.
Yeah, and this becomes really important to this point Gretchen is just making. Sometimes I've had principals say the parent reached out to me, I gave them my private cell phone number so that they could, talk to me about their students' immigration status and figuring out FAFSA and all of these things. Well, guess what? The district is paying for your cell phone. You're getting a cell phone allowance from the district. And so it's not as cut and dry as people think, that just because you decouple the district server and you're a high-ranking district official, you still may have an obligation to respond to Public Records Act request, including things that are maintained on your private device that the district is paying for or is within the scope of your employment. So there are many overlapping issues here, but I really want us to be mindful that what we need to approach the immigration data with is a very holistic point of perspective. There is, of course, the enrollment pieces when kids first come into the system. That's one place which is a soft target, which I think. The other place where we have a lot of data is on the high school side, where kids are either applying for FAFSA, whether you have kids applying for college apps and you have high school athletics. Then you have the soft data that is being maintained with respect to free and reduced lunch, sometimes transportation related issues, if there are SPED issues in place that also have data. And then I think one of the things that we have not talked about is if you're getting Title III migrant ed funding. If you're getting that funding, there is a requirement. If you're getting a lot of funding from the federal government, there is a requirement to actually capture the number of migrant kids you have and the areas of birth. What we need to discern, and this is where you have to talk to your auditors. This is a conversation way bigger than all of us on this call regarding what is required, what is needed, what is the absolute must threshold versus all the other stuff, the extraneous stuff that you're putting together. And so we need to delineate that. And again, not an individual call made in a bigger picture conversation with the school board and in line with your strategic plan and priorities of the communities that you serve.
Another issue that's been raised a few times here in the Q&A is record retention. And I think that is another subject that would be great for a follow-up training on records and maintenance of records, and very specifically the CUME file and other type of files, because record retention there's three categories. You do have records that are going to be permanent. You have some records that are temporary, and you have some that can be destroyed and don't need to be maintained at all. But that's a very specific, comprehensive body of law and list of records. So I think that would be great for a follow-up training to help you all understand which type of records have to be kept in perpetuity and which ones are on a timeline. And there's a variety of different rules that apply. There's also a great question in here about referring back to your board policy. And where'd that go? Oh, it says, to make sure you take a look at your board policy. And I think that goes to Namita's point also. This is not a decision that is made by one school administrator or one school site person. It is take a look at your board policy and ask your administration if you're not sure what your process and procedure should be. Is there anything else you want to add about board policies, Namita, in the role here?
I mean, boards are grappling with the situation. Some of them are adopting safe haven resolutions. Some are adopting, resolutions that say we will cooperate only if we have a official federal warrant. Whatever your policy is, at the end of the day, I think if you get a record request that is asking for immigration status related issues, or you think there is going to be immigration status related issue released, I think you have to do your due diligence on your end to make sure that you are covering all the bases. You bring your cabinet into play, you bring your superintendent and perhaps even the board into play around the big policy concerns. And this is also a place where districts have to think about how they partner with third-party entities outside. There are plenty of advocacy organizations that are available to work with school districts. Not that I am trying to scare anyone, but there is a new DOJ guidance, Department of Justice letter that basically says that the Department of Justice has the right to prosecute anybody they feel is hindering, obstructing, or harboring any kind of circumvention of these federal enforcements, federal ICE enforcements. And very often districts find themselves in a place where you want to do the right thing. You feel like you've promised parents safety. But I caution you, as a public employee, you have to act within the scope of your employment. Advocacy work is not the work of you as a public employee. There are districts that have advocates. There are districts that have lobbyists. There are districts that partner with local advocates. This is beyond many of us that are on this call as presenters and attendees. And so when it comes down to it, your obligation to public education is to act within the scope of your employment, not act beyond the scope. And if you feel that there are issues being with respect to data requests, data documentation, data maintenance that are being kept that are beyond the scope of your employment, I would urge you to talk to the CBO, the superintendent, and address it at a board level.
We've also had several questions come in about Public Records Act compliance and this idea of searching personal devices and personal accounts, and how directors of IT might be doing those searches across all district devices. I think that's something that we could certainly share in the follow-up training that goes along with record retention.
Yeah, and when you started talking about that, my eyes started to twitch because it just seems like it's just very litigious of late. There's a lot of entities that are PRA happy, if you will. And so it's a perfect opportunity to not just outside of the immigration discussion itself, to take a look at what your policies are, especially in and around emails and chats and so forth, because it just seems like they're getting picked on quite a bit. And if you don't have an established cutoff, then you're opening yourselves up to just years and years and years worth. And I know from an attorney standpoint that maybe that makes them happy because it's billable hours. No, you don't want to go through it, Gretchen? No.
Oh, come on. Does anybody want to look at old emails? And nobody does. It's a waste of public resources. And
unless they're about Chipotle.
Yeah.
Before we wrap up, because I know we only have a few minutes left, I did want to share, I know that there's a lot of conversation, a lot of information that's been shared today, especially for a lot of those of you, for those of you on the webinar that go back and, look at the student data and participate in the enrollment process or creating that workflow. CITE has a great resource that's been published on the website for data governance. It helps you collect and track what types of data, right? The data of data is where all your information and those data sources are coming from. It's a free template. So please feel free to use that and customize it to capture these types of things that we're talking about now in the webinar. It's really going to help give you that holistic overview of what lives where and who's responsible for what. And we hope helps you identify workflows where that data transparency is clear for you now in terms of what types of data are we collecting that may be sensitive, where can we maybe make some modifications, and how can we align, again, our processes with our policies.
And shameless plug to piggyback on Maggie, we'll be presenting it at CASBO, basically all things data governance. So it'll play perfectly into our session. So whether you get the link or you come to the session, a lot more to talk about in that particular space.
Thank you, Maggie and Eric. We're getting close to the hour. I just want to give all of our panelists an opportunity to share any last thoughts before we close for the day.
Well, I'm just going to say, don't treat this as a brand new fight. This has been always existent. We are talking about interfacing with law enforcement, not just ICE. And we're talking about data privacy. These laws have existed forever. FERPA is still the law of the land. And so nothing new here. It's all about making sure that our practices are tight and we go back to the basics.
And I'd just like to commend you all for taking the time to try to better understand this and your jobs and responsibilities around it, and we understand this is maybe a stressful time or a challenging issue to tackle. And there are tremendous resources out there that have been shared today. You know, the CDE is providing with resources. The Attorney General has a terrific resource. And so there's information out there, but you're probably faced with a little information overload. So I'm really glad we have this opportunity today for you all to pose questions, and continue to pose those questions to CITE and to CASBO, because we, you know, to the extent there's the desire, we can do a follow-up session that drills down more deeply on what your questions are.
All right. Well, I would like to say thank you, Namita, Gretchen, Maggie, Erick, for being with us today, sharing your expertise, answering all of these questions. Thank you to those who joined us today. We hope this is the beginning of a conversation that you are going to have with the leadership within your district and with us in the future. We are going to work on getting a records retention webinar together so we can come back and continue this conversation as we all navigate through the times we are in. So again, thank you so much for being with us today. This webinar will be available as a recording. You all receive that, and please continue to send questions our way, and we will work on getting those answered for you. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone.
Thanks so much.